My name is Borda, and coming from three institutions today, University of Melbourne, UCL, my alma mater, and I'm also a new associate at Climate Museum UK, which this topic sort of is really important to understand a bit further, and the role of cultural organizations and museums in the climate change debate. This front image is Donny Creek. I'm from Canada. You might hear from the accent. This is one of the main fires that have been happening in Canada. And just to emphasize, so what causes these extreme changes? There are natural changes in weather patterns. We've seen that for millennia. It's been documented. But what's happened now is the acceleration due to our own consumptions and needs. So everything from energy consumption, waste consumption, transport, degradation of the environment. So these are all adding to greenhouse gases, which are accelerated warming and melting of the polar caps and sea rises. And we're seeing many more events that are related to this. So the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 13, is one of several which is concerned with this area. And the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has noted that this one in particular is associated with a lot of risks that need mitigation. As a museum or cultural organization, where do we fit in SDG 13? There are different indicators for each of the Sustainable Development Goals. For climate action, there's one around improving education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity building, which I'm sort of talking on about today. So what has the cultural sector been doing so far? Well, in 2015, there was the first climate museum in the US, based in New York, and the Climate Museum UK followed shortly afterward. And this is a distributed museum. There's no physical storefront to it. It's an experimental museum with different people doing activations. There's also the Museums and Climate Change Network, which is a much more international body. And there's also local bodies of museums and cultural organizations coming together. And here in London, I've just been here a week and a bit, and there's several exhibitions on climate change and environment related exhibitions. So Dear Earth, I really encourage you to go and see that collective of artists responding to climate change and the environment. And you get wonderful women artists in that show as well, like Agnes Dennis and Andrea Bowers. Polar Silk Road at the Natural History Museum. Serpentine, Thomas and Saraceno, if you've seen that. And you get the Earth Photo Exhibition from the Royal Geographical Society. This is a past example, but Whitechapel, looking at art action. The British Center of Photography also has landscape trauma. And also there's the BBC Earth Experience, which is a little bit more of a marketing one, but worth the experience. So this little study is just really an exploration about how climate change narratives in immersive virtual reality are represented in museum and gallery physical and online spaces. This work is largely being done over COVID, so I'll be saying that I haven't seen everything in person, but it also just brought into play how we look at VR and we look at immersive aspects of climate change for reflection and mobilization. Now, VR already has quite a strong sense of empathy that can be generated. Virtual nature experiences are also have been studied, and to show that there are empathy and positive social emotions that can be generated through a virtual nature experience, and mental health indicators and well-being, positivity, all being part of a virtual nature experience, much like we might experience in real nature. So if we hear sounds of nature, we instantly think about our relationship to it. And studies, again, have reinforced the positivity of being even in a virtual nature experience. During COVID, Forestry England put out quite a few videos of 360s about forest bathing and in other ways we can engage in experiences which might not have been possible over COVID. Google Arts and Culture have been providing a number of 360 experiences, originally through Google Expeditions, which school children were accessing. And studies show that children were learning about empathy and positive environmental behavior through these apps. And so Google Culture itself has a number of destinations, as it were, that can be viewed through VR and through your desktop. And they're worth looking at, particularly if we're thinking about impacts on the environment and how VR can also be a vehicle for us to experience different locations without, let's say, the carbon issues of travel. So pro-environmental behavior is a very important part of this experience with VR and with exposure to real natural and environmental agendas. And pro-environmental behaviors that step toward coming to a position where we act on something, whether it's mitigation of environmental degradation or climate change. So things like games are very important also to reinforce pro-environmental behavior, because it's actually engaging us to do something like this game, Echo Game Reef Builders, to build a coral reef. The Stanford Oceanographic, Ocean Acidification game, which is a VR game, has been around for a number of years, and studies have been following this one on the experiences of people who are playing this VR game, which allows you to walk along coral beds and see what coral bleaching does to coral. And there have been studies showing very positive change to people who are engaged in that. Now, the exhibitions that I've looked at have largely been across 2019 and 2022, and they come at a time of global convergence, such as the youth climate activism, grassroots protests, the IPCC reports that came out. So the last IPCC report was 2013, and this is now 2022 that the most recent one had come out. And then the COP 25, 26, and 27 events, and not least the COVID pandemic highlighted both the digital divide, but also the need for digital inclusion within the cultural sector. Now, the exhibitions that I looked at in this exploratory study, this is one of the areas where it needs to be thought through a little bit more about what we might mean by immersion, an immersive climate change exhibition, and what are the impactful differences across them. And I've chosen just a selection that go across the spectrum of, anything from having a game controller and looking at a screen to something much more immersive where you're having auditory and full sensory experience. So I was here in London when I went to We Live in an Ocean of Air, which was the Marshmallow Laser Feast installation at Saatchi. And this is all about looking at the way the life cycle of air and oxygen, and the breathing and lungs as an inverted tree, and then having real trees, producing oxygen and converting, all the bad air into good air. And it was an HTC Vive kit that all participants were hooked up with. Then Another one is a downloadable app, and you can see this in Steam VR, is a very nice example of just taking an old-fashioned diorama in a museum and converting it into an app or a VR experience. And so, and this one was in partnership with the Natural History Museum of LA County and the University of Southern California. So students worked on this project. Arcadia Earth was in New York, and I don't know, Tula, if you've ever went to see it, but Valentino Vittori is an experimental artist. He invited a number of artists to create several rooms, about 15 rooms, showing different sort of environmental ecosystems, air, soil, the oceans. And there were both VR and AR components to this, as well as just physical navigation around the spaces. Hyperrealities was a group show at Art Science Museum of Singapore, and I'm just drawn to Marina Abramovich's Rising app, which shows the artist as an avatar in a tank of water, and the participant is sort of provoked to say, are we going to save the oceans together, or prevent warming, and as you make choices, the water either rises or lowers in the tank. And Marina Abramovich's app became part of a Nobel Prize app for, I think, COP, one of the COP events as well. That's how powerful it is. So our time on Earth was one I hadn't seen, which is at the Barbican. Again, Marshmallow Laser Feast here was featured on the front, with a beautiful Colombian rainforest tree showing photosynthesis. This is a visual installation. There is no interactivity, but it does show another example of how we can interact with these stories that are being told through art and through technology. So I'm just going to click on this YouTube video of Symbiosis, which was done by Polymorph, a Netherlands experience design firm. It's the most advanced of all of these examples, which use soft robotics and haptics, brings you into a future world of where we have human-animal relationships. And the suits were designed to make you feel like you were one of these creatures in this environment. And you were fed food, and you were feeling things and smelling things as part of the experience. So I'll just let it run for a few seconds. So it's quite an elaborate setup. This one was taking place at the Borda Art Museum, and you can see the scent bottles and the gills or whatever popping up, and then this is the testing or tasting food. Yeah. So quite exciting. I can't get there now. So what was characteristic of these examples are they're standalone exhibitions. They weren't necessarily connected to other parts of a space or a museum or gallery. And of course, by nature of being VR or immersive, they had limited number of participants, and over COVID as well, limited supporting information. So you're enjoying this as an experience. So what was pre and post? And of course, like Symbiosis and some of the others cost to participate, and not reasonable for somebody, coming from a lower economic background, for instance. So what we don't know about these exhibitions is what are we coming to as an individual? What are our climate literacy levels? Are we coming with pro-environmental connections that are going to, surface pre or post as a result of seeing this show? And what are the impactful differences across the different types of immersion? Because these are different types of experience. Some we may be able to talk to people around us about an exhibition, others we're just completely isolated. And similarly with the spaces. And that's all dependent on how some of these exhibits are arranged, how artists have chosen to bring together the different elements. And of course, some of these exhibitions already coming together as education directed, others are artist led, like Arcadia Earth, for instance, and Symbiosis and the Futuristic. So what about mobilization? Well, if I just do a very, very simple tally, mitigation or ways in which we can save the planet, we're more around Arcadia Earth and our time on Earth. Abramovich's Rising was a literal pledge to, you know, keep safe the world and stop, you know, creating extra damage to environment. And then there's self-guided learning and reflection, which is basically all of the above. So how does VR work? Well, across these, I would say that VR works as an alternative platform. It helps participants reflect, but to the extent we need further study on that. It brought together things that we couldn't see, so invisible connections, like the our time on Earth and the air we breathe, the ocean of air, and also scenarios of possible futures, both destructive and possibly positive if we think about human-animal relationships. So opportunities for museums and cultural organizations. I mean, I'm thinking about integrating mindfully different type of media and not forgetting the physical and online, and that has a lot of bearing on what we spoke today about, and supporting different connections for both self-guided and guided learning. And thinking about diverse knowledge and multiple perspectives in these exhibitions. A lot of them were very closed. We didn't have access to other perspectives or knowledges. And also thinking about activation. So for instance, the Climate Museum UK will take an activation outside of a cultural organization, and you're outside in the field doing the activation. And so this is an example from Australia where I'm based, and I remember the Sydney smoke, which was the bushfires in 2018. And I mean, this was just blanketed, just like New York was a few weeks ago. I'm thinking about the way kids can engage, and this is kids building up an air quality monitor to pick up the particulate matter in the air. And then Indigenous knowledges. I mean, I have the privilege of also being in Australia for some time, and Lynette Walworth's Collisions is definitely worth taking a look at. And this is a VR camera at the front, and this Indigenous elder man, Yari Morgan, talking about the story that atomic tests took place in South Australia, and his connections to this Western technology, and the Martu tribe of which he belongs. And there's also developments toward Indigenous metaverses. Like this one is by the Anishinaabe groups of Eastern Canada and US, and creating these metaverse environments, talking about how we can bring back our time on Earth. And We Are Earth was a collective statement that was in the Our Time on Earth in the Barbican. This is by a Brazilian collective, sending a letter out to all of us about our role. And I'd just like to end with these words of Nyari Morgan, that all of these stories are our stories, and we're experiencing this as a lived experience. And so it is about carrying these stories, because it is not just our story, it's for everyone. And I think it also brings back Graham's thing about preservation and how these stories can be preserved as well and translated to future generations. And that's it. Thank you.